everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here and to be engaged into this 2 days really productive and engaging exchange of ideas and perspectives on the issues of our region security. And today we hope we will make an interesting input as well. And the title of our discussion is Aligning Defense Strategies, Sweden, Finland, and NATO Collective Defense. Let me introduce the panelists of this discussion and welcome them to the stage. So Tomas Jermalavičius, Head of Studies of International Center for Defense and Security. Mr. Olof Ehrenkrona, a former ambassador, board member, representing Institute from the Security and Development Policy. And Eoin McNamara, research fellow from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Sweden and Finland have long maintained military neutrality. But it changed. It changed in February 2022 when Russia started a full-scale invasion in Ukraine. The biggest war in European continent since World War II. And now Sweden and Finland are the new NATO member states. And this shift from neutrality to the NATO and its collective defense presents new opportunities but challenges as well. Since this transformation requires adjustment in national defense policies and in military structures as well. And as it was mentioned here in the previous presentation, Sweden and also Finland have long standing tradition of combining military and civilian aspects of the defense. And during the Cold War, it crystallized into the well-known concept of the total defense, which was mentioned here in this event numerous times by the different presenters as one of the good examples and maybe one of the direction where our security architecture should focus on. So considering all these aspects, the aim of the panel is to discuss what are the key conceptual and operational challenges during the integration process. What is the integration of the concept of total defense and collective security, and what are the lessons from Ukraine that might be considered in this particular context? Mr. Olof, maybe you could start our discussion with insights and overview from the Sweden point of view.
Thank you. I will start to say that my two Swedish friends made a very, very good explanation of the Swedish civil defense and some of the lessons learned from the war in Ukraine. So I won't dwell on this. I won't echo them. But let me say one important thing. We had a new government coming into power in 22. It was a change in the sense that we got, for the first time, a National Security Council, and we also got a minister in the Minister of Defense, specially responsibility for the civil defense. And this is a part of a structural change of the Swedish security policy and defense policy as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. External security and internal security, there are two sides of the same coin. There is a new geopolitical landscape. During the Cold War, Sweden was a frontline state. Today, we are not even mentioned among the frontline states. When I look at your map, Sweden and Denmark and Germany is not considered to be part of the Baltics, but we are. Sweden has, and Finland, when we became members of the NATO, we changed the geopolitical landscape of the Northern Europe. And that is very important to understand, because we are members of NATO, but we also have bilateral agreements with the United Kingdom and the United States. Important bilateral agreements because there might be a period of indecisiveness if there is an attack, considering Article 5. But those bilateral agreements gives the possibility to store war material, maintenance in Finland and Sweden. This means that we are very, very much a primary goal in the beginning of a conflict. And this means that robustness and resilience must work from the first day, the first hours. We need to have enough strength to absorb an attack, and we must have enough strength to take a hit, and enough capacity to restore what is destroyed. And we have seen all this in Ukraine, how important it is. Today is partly a different story from the Cold War. Then the civil defense very much was geared to take the consequences of a nuclear strike. This is, of course, also a possibility today, but it is a much broader picture of the threats today. We have extremely decentralized threats today, and we have seen this growing for the last decades with the terrorist threats. But there is another thing that is coming now, and that is the disruptive technologies. The fact that we have a number of the technologies that are developing in an exponentially trade, according to Moore's law. And those technologies, they get synergetic effects by the software, by the artificial intelligence. So you combine all those technologies and you get an enormous technological power, change of technological power. And one of the most important lessons of the war in Ukraine is the pace of technological change. This pace will become even more important during the coming years. We talk about dual-use technologies. With artificial intelligence, it's all-use technologies. We have synthetic biology, we have digitalization, we have the possibility to voice manipulation through AI. And yesterday's announced the Nobel laureate of physics, Geoffrey Hinton, he said, I would do the same today, but I'm very worried of the consequences of machine that is learning by themselves and creating more intelligent machines than the human. So the issue is now, how are we going to respond? And this involves the whole of the society. And we have heard about many examples how this is done in today's war theater. It's the war of the wills, as Clausewitz says. It's asymmetric war. There is no silver bullet, but we must understand what's going on. And we need to have transparency. We go from attribution to distribution of knowledge. So people are prepared to the threats. So people, as much possible as it is going to be prepared for the hybrid warfares and how it will be affecting their lives and their. So it is extremely important, I would say, to understand that the open society's main thing is to prepare and to preserve its openness and make the citizens a part of the fighting.
Thank you so much. Eoin, maybe you could elaborate more on the Finland case, Finland perspective. What are the key issues and aspects of integration over there?
Yeah, so Eoin McNamara is my name. I'm I'm an Irishman, but I work at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and I've previous to that, I worked at the University of Tartu in Estonia, so very Nordic Baltic. I've been Balticized in many ways. So one thing I'm very interested in is Finnish comprehensive security and what others might be able to learn from that. Finnish comprehensive security, I mean, NAY, or previously referred to as total defense. Finns kind of moved away from that concept. And it's important when we talk about this, to, you know, it's both a civilian security concept and a military security concept, but the military core is still very, very important. It's always worth reminding people of the numbers. Finland, small country, population of 5.5 million people. The professional core of the Finnish Defence Forces, 22,000. Its rapid reaction reserve from that, built from its very successful conscription system, which I'll mention in a moment. There's a lot of lessons to be learned there. Interestingly, when we talk about Finland, Finns are extremely humble. As an Irishman, as an outsider, I've lived in Finland now for 3 years. I'm always taken aback at the humility of Finnish societies. They don't propose themselves as a model. In fact, they often discourage people from taking Finland as a model. But still, we have delegations turning up week on week, month on month, trying to learn from what the Finns do well. And what they do well is their conscript system, which builds a rapid reaction reserve, 280,000 mobilizable for wartime. And when they fully mobilize their reserve, they have 900,000 personnel under arms. So their conscription system, it creates value. I think there's lessons to be learned, maybe Lithuania, Estonia in the past, Ukraine, that the conscription system, it's seen very holistically. It's seen as creating value for those who undertake it. It's definitely not a waste of time. It's something that will boost your character, give you great proprietorship of the state, and provide you with networks that will help you in your career and help you as a strong citizen, a strong member of society going into the future. So Finnish males, 82% of Finnish males do conscription, and they're queuing up to do it. High motivation, high morale. And now, like Sweden and maybe Norway, some of the other countries, there's actually quite a significant lobby to have it mixed gender on a compulsory basis. Females can volunteer currently, but they're talking also about making it mixed gender and compulsory, making it more whole of society, if you will. So that's very, very cohesive, it's very holistic, and it's very meaningful, and it provides a very strong social platform for the defense system. You need that buy-in, that whole of society buy-in. And I think Lithuania, which abolished conscription for about a decade, Sweden as well, maybe, you know, getting back up to speed with conscription, there's a lot of lessons learned there. And indeed with Ukraine as well. I'm of the belief, and I hope I'm not the only one, I hope this is the mainstream belief, that Ukraine, when this war ends, Ukraine in one form or another will need hard defense security guarantees. There's no going back to the days of the meaningless Budapest memorandum, just so Russia can rearm again in the future and go for another war, another escalation. So, but behind those defense guarantees, self-sufficiency in security and defense is very, very important as well. So I think Ukraine needs no mentorship in this regard. The war has completely transformed Ukrainian perspectives on the value of the military and of military service and of serving your country. But it is good also to remember that as well, that you need a strong conscription system that is very well integrated with society going into the future. It gives you an extra layer of strength behind the actual security guarantees. And I think this is being learned around the Baltic Sea region and in Finland. So the conscription dimension, very, very important. Finland, of course, they never forgot they never forgot that firepower is very, very important. A big emphasis on security of supply with ammunition and munitions that maybe other European countries took their eye off the ball in a way. So when Finland mobilizes its reserve, it's got the largest, I think it's a toss-up between Finland and Turkey as to who has the strongest artillery system in NATO now. So they'll meet fire with fire, and the Russians know this. So that gives them a very strong deterrent effect, that the Russians, if they want to play games, if they want to incur, that there will be a very high penalty for that. So Finland is a country renowned for its music, for its heavy metal. The Finns, when they joined NATO, they brought a lot of heavy metal to the party in the form of their artillery system. So not far from a border country, of course, Finland has a very strong global foreign policy, very strong in peace mediation, crisis management, UN peacekeeping missions, etc. So not just a regional power, but a contributor, a small state contributor to global security. So it's President a number of weeks ago said, you know, previously in Finland they used to calculate the balance, the regional balance very, very carefully. It was one of the reasons, despite being very compatible with NATO, despite being very supportive of NATO, in the region, the Finns largely saw NATO in the Baltic states, or Baltic NATO enlargement, as a stabilizing feature, that they thought they had enough with their strong independent defense capacity. And I think what Olof mentioned, Sweden was like this as well. Very strong cooperation with NATO, with the EU, within NORDEFCO, you know, military-to-military cooperation, multinational cooperation that keeps armed forces competitive, that keeps armed forces sharp. And that is something, for lessons learned into the future, that is something we need to integrate Ukraine and its armed forces into. Because from the war, they've a lot of stuff to teach us. Mentioned drone warfare. They're really now at the cutting edge. They've a lot of stuff to teach our militaries, and our militaries can also transfer knowledge to them to add that further layer of strength. So, as I was going to mention, Alexander Stubb said now from that regional balance, now that they've joined NATO, they're moving from a situation of action, what he said, active stability politics to value-based realism. So Finland, strong promoter of liberal values with a very ambitious president, Alexander Stubb, but a very realist country at the heart that won't take its eye off the ball and will always be ready and prepared. Security supply is very important. It's worth looking up. I don't have time to go into it, but the National Emergency Supply Agency of Finland, a very, very important agency, government agency, supporting Finnish resilience, supporting Finnish security of supply in civilian society, electricity, infrastructure, data, food, medicines, so that in a crisis, Finns are never left abandoned, and they are ready. It's a very good case study to look it up, NESA. So the theme I will end on, of course, I mentioned Finnish humility at the beginning, but foreigners charm them quite a lot. And right now, many of you will learn or will have known about the Niinistö report, the former president, or the recently former president of Finland. He's been asked by Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, to prepare a report for the European Union on how the European Union might be able to gain lessons from Finland's approach to readiness. So when we look at this, I think this is going to be very important when we talk about a European way of deterrence. And we must move in this direction in Europe. We look at the next, if the US election, Trump spells more unpredictability for the transatlantic link. But even if Donald Trump is defeated by Kamala Harris, if you look at the trend lines within the Democratic Party, it's still primarily China that is driving the US force posture. Europe is still a secondary theater for the United States. And even if a Democrat, Kamala Harris, takes over in the White House in the spring, they will be looking for the Europeans to do more. So we really need to think about a European way of doing deterrence, of a European way of resilience, without American structural power for the large part, or without American enablers. The enhanced forward presence is very much based on US speed to move. US technology, US logistics, US command and control. A lot of that we will have to do ourselves, and if we don't have a lot of that in Europe, sometimes the Americans, they have stronger systems than the Europeans. So we will have to think about alternative ways. We might need heavier lines along the eastern flank because we can't move troops as quickly as NATO can currently at the moment with US enablers. So we need to be ready in Europe. We need to do more for ourselves. And that Nordic ethos of self-sufficiency in comprehensive security does provide many lessons in doing so. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting angle. And moving forward, Tomas, what is the Baltic states' perception on integration of Sweden and Finland, of new members? What are the expectations and maybe the challenges regarding these processes?
Well, it's fantastic. You know, really welcome to the club. And you know, this. I think very few people in the Baltics even thought that this would be possible. Maybe 10 years back, when I was at the Baltic Defense College talking at the roundtable, I was torn into by a German participant of the roundtable by daring to suggest that the best way forward for the cohesion of this operational strategic space and the political space is to get Sweden and Finland into NATO. So basically, it was unthinkable. 14 years ago, 12 years ago, 10 years ago. Now it's a reality. And my think tank in Tallinn has done a study looking into the challenges for Sweden and Finland of integrating them into NATO. A lot of practical things, like filling the command structure with people, officers and COs. The requirement is quite substantial, and then finding those people, integrating NATO's career paths into national career paths and so on, which are quite separate, especially in Finland, is also a challenge. But these are practical things which will be overcome. In our thinking, the mental cultural shift is probably the biggest challenge for both countries. First of all, that now they are part of the team, and they will have to be good team players, and really take seriously these capability targets that come from NATO, and in some cases even give them priority over the national ideas and the requirements and so on, that so basically this will have to be part of the planning habit where we put NATO collectives defense first, and the self-reliance and self-sufficiency and the self-interest second. That will take time. Accepting very top-down intrusive scrutiny from NATO headquarters on the capabilities that are in place, and these targets that are put forward will also be difficult, especially when the establishments, particularly in Finland, is closed up and doesn't want to discuss these things with the outsiders, because the outsiders are not to be trusted that much. And of course, in the process, generate deployable capabilities. For instance, in the land domain, we would probably think of a brigade from each member state, new ally, which would be a challenge, despite all the figures that Eoin mentioned. This is very much a territorial defense force in Finland. So if you want to generate a deployable brigade, in the spirit that Finland's defense starts at the southern border of Turkey, for instance, rather than just on the eastern border of Finland, this will be a challenge. This will be a challenge for Sweden, especially where the force structures and capabilities atrophied. They became small or expeditionary-oriented. And I think now Lithuanian land forces numerically are bigger than Sweden's land force. So that's going to be a big challenge as well. Also, change ways of talking about and to Russia. Deterrence signaling is a very important aspect, and I think in both cases, Swedish neutrality and the long-standing centuries and so on, and Finland's non-alignment or Finlandization, as some put it, affected the way they sort of communicate about Russia and towards Russia. One of the examples was pretty recent. You might remember this case when somebody discovered in the Russian governmental system the document whereby the Russian government was suggested that they would unilaterally review the maritime border in the Gulf of Finland. There was a lot of, basically the Baltic policymakers, they blew it up on X and social media platforms and so on. The Finns said, oh, it's nothing. Okay, how do you know it's nothing, not part of any hybrid campaign or, any sort of testing? Well, we reached out for diplomatic channels to Moscow and they assured us it was nothing, it was a mistake. right. Russian diplomacy never lies and is fully aware of what is happening. You know, the two things you should never take for granted. But the Finns decided that in the public domain, this kind of a strategic communication is the best way forward. Now, we need to really compare the notes and sing from the same sheet. And that will be quite a challenge. It's also a challenge sort of for NATO in certain regards to integrate these two new allies. We hear a lot of excitement about total defense and how much we can learn from Sweden and Finland about total defense. Guess what? There's no such thing as total defense in NATO. You can read NATO's strategic concept, you can read its strategies, policies, allied publications. There are echoes of it in many regards, like civil-military cooperation, civil preparedness, comprehensive approach during the expeditionary era, now baseline requirements for resilience, which are 7 of them, but and some instruments maybe to integrate the civilian inputs into the military effort. But NATO doesn't do total defense. It's us here on the front lines who want to throw everything in a kitchen sink at Russians. It's not the case for the allies farther down, back to the west. So NATO and SECURE play with the forces and packages which are, TO8, transfer of authority, assigned to NATO by the nations. We are not assigning in Lithuania Rifleman Union to SECURE. We're not, assigning Kaitseli to SECURE in Estonia. These are, the separate efforts on top and above what NATO does. What we need to do to make sure that this integration between the national and collective efforts is as seamless as possible. We don't get in the way of NATO and its execution of its defense plans, but we also kind of add a value for our total defense efforts in that regard. So this will be quite a challenge for NATO. But the national diversity means that there cannot be a single total defense concept across the entire NATO. Simply because each nation, and in each nation, because of the unique strategic cultures, political cultures, administrative, legal frameworks and cultures, the actual practice of total defense will be different. And a few things, regarding the actual emerging practice and also thinking in the Baltic states, which some of this borrowed from Sweden and Finland. And Sweden, by the way, also has to do a lot of work to regenerate this total defense machinery, which, they have the body, the muscle memory for that. And they're doing on a very steep curve to restore it, but it's still, not there. So in the Baltic states, I think a few things we need to also kind of think that total defense will never be total. Not everybody will contribute in the society. Not everybody will have a place or will want to have a place in the total level. So we have to be quite realistic. We shouldn't think that government or the governments shouldn't think that they will always be in full control and giving orders to everybody. There will be civil society actors, there will be organizations, there will be volunteers that will be doing their own thing, sometimes not even listening to the government, and sometimes it's even good, because what deters Russians, they are afraid. I had this conversation with one Russian analyst quite a few years back. He said, he approached me several times. Thomas, is it correct that in the Baltic states you can, unit commanders can start resistance and defense against aggression without waiting orders from the capital? From the government? Yes, that's our constitutional makeup. This is how it's set up to avoid 1940 again. For them, I don't know, some church choir lobbing ballistic missiles at the Russian forces is just unthinkable. I'm exaggerating, of course, but still. So government is not everything, and many good things, and Ukraine is a good example, happen not because of government, but despite of it. So that's what we have to bear in mind. And also, we shouldn't get too nation-centric. The total defense, our reliance of other allied societies should be also, explored. How we can draw in the resources from the countries like further away, Germany, US, Canada. The volunteers, the resources, the charitable, contributions, all the things that now Ukraine is getting. We will also be getting that. But there are logistical challenges, there are bureaucratic challenges with the custom authorities, whatnot. Even very personal challenges. And a personal example I like to give, I live in Estonia. If war happens, borders shut, we saw that during COVID, impossible to travel. I have a citizen's duty to defend my country, but I'm stuck in Estonia. Why can't I defend my country from Estonia, joining Estonian Defense Forces or Defense League or, and so on? But I can't without the government's permission. And I can't imagine Lithuanian government sitting back and deliberating and issuing Jermalavičius a permit to join the Estonian military formations. We have some automaticity or waiver to any Lithuanian living abroad when it's Article 5, join that the country of residence's forces or paramilitary organizations, voluntary networks, and so on, and do the duty to Lithuania and to the alliance. As for Sweden and Finland, just a couple of words, there are certain risks associated with the membership that we explore also in our report. First of all, they're still locked up in their own Nordic bubble. The Nordic dimension of cooperation within NATO, it's very much emphasized. Now, they want to be together under the same Joint Force Command, Norfolk. So there will be seams in the region between Norfolk Command and Brunssum Command, somewhere, in the Baltic Sea. So again, we need to look at it, how to avoid those seams and make the operations across the region as smooth as possible. And we also should avoid the language of, for instance, that the Swedish and Finnish membership offers greater strategic depth to the defense of the Baltic states. That's a very wrong notion. Strategic depth basically means that you trade space for time in order to be able to counterattack from one of the advantageous positions. We don't want to trade our little spaces we have here in the Baltic states for time. So it's not a strategic depth of the Baltic states. We probably give strategic depth to the Finnish and Swedish defense, but still, we should avoid these kind of misguided narrative metaphors, also NATO lake narratives that come together with Swedish and Finnish membership, especially if that sends the wrong signal to allies in the south, further in the west, that, right, Sweden and Finland are in NATO now, this whole region is integrated, job done, congratulate ourselves and go back to have some tea. No, we need the presence of all allies here, involvement of all allies here as much as possible, because there's still a vulnerable area where the balance of forces still favors Russia, geography and time favors Russia, and we need to be more serious about not just having a tripwire, 3 brigades in each of the Baltic states, but really serious in-place forces, allied and national, to be able to implement deterrence by denial. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think our discussion brings some interesting points to the table since we discussed, for instance, total defense just from the positive side and sometimes as a medicine for all the disease. So what it needs to be emphasized, there are many practicalities that needs to be considered when we're talking about integration with the collective defense. And moreover, I think we should talk about so-called tailor-made total defense, and that reflects the specifics of the particular member state. But moving forward, coming back to the total defense, one of the key aspects of the total defense is assuring that the population is prepared for the different security threats. What particular threats should be now in focus when we're talking about the society and the population? Are they targeted from the external point of view, or each nation has internal issues that need to be considered from the national security perspective?
Well, it's both, basically. And I think that we should be fully aware of the fact that many of those hybrid war activities are already in place. We had yesterday one of the biggest Finnish and Swedish banks, Nordea, was actually a target for a big DDoS attack, and people couldn't reach their bank accounts. This has happened daily. And what we need to do is to get the people to understand, the civilians to understand that this is something that happens every day. It will increase. There will be new methods in order to fight a hybrid war. We have quite clear indications that Iranians are using gang criminals in Sweden in order to apply aggression towards Israel, for example. We have had a number of incidents the last 10, 15, 20 years where there has been aggression from Russian so-called networks. This is the reality today, and we need to get people to understand that there will be there will be things happening that is not very nice. And we have to be able to fight it. We have to be able to be resilient. But resilience is not only something good in good societies. There is a resilience also in very bad societies. There is a dysfunctional resilience we are now seeing in Russia, trying to re-establish habits from the Tsarists, from Stalin, from the Soviet Union. So we must understand what's going on. We must take people into the consideration, into the picture, and we must release all the creativity that is in the open societies and the free markets, just as they have done in Ukraine. I think it has been fantastic to see how the civil society and citizens in general has responded to the crisis. Remember the first days when people sat in the squares making Molotov cocktails that was applied in Finland during 1939 and 1941 and 44. Today they are not making Molotov cocktails, they are making drones. And this is a fundamental change. Total war means total defense, and Russia is fighting a total war. And the idea behind the bombings, the ideas behind the individual manhunt that we see in Kherson, where they use drone to kill individuals. The idea is to subjugate the people, to get the willingness of defense to erode and to make the support for the military and the politicians vanish. And it's extremely important that we understand that we talk about it, that we have transparency of what is happening and transparency of what we are doing against it. And we are a broad alliance now in NATO. And this is a defense alliance, defensive alliance, but it's also an alliance where we must share information on what we are doing. When we had a big attack in 2017 on the Åland Islands, the Åland Islanders got the information from the defense or the foreign minister of Lithuania, who had a press briefing telling the international press that Lithuania was the target for a very heavy attack. And he also mentioned that it was the Åland Islands. And then the Åland Islands started to see what happened and found out that there was a cyber war going on in the Baltic Sea on the demilitarized island of Åland. So it's one of the illustrations that how important it is to understand the impact of the new technologies and understand that there is a space up there, there's a space war up there, but it's also a war on an atomic scale and a molecule scale. If you use rearrange atoms and molecules in order to create medicines, you can also rearrange them in order to create poison. There was an experiment done a year ago or so where you produced in a few hours thousands of molecules just as poisonous as Novichok with the help of AI. So that's the reality. It's positive, but it's also very risky.
Yeah, I think when you go across the civil-military continuum, different gradients of threat, there is a myriad. The bad news is there's a myriad of threats, particularly hybrid threats, facing us. The good news is, of course, that if we don't get complacent, we keep our vigilance up, that we can manage these threats. Of course, resilience is, in a positive sense, it is that bounce-back ability. Sometimes, stuff happens. There's a slightly more rude way of phrasing it. Stuff happens, and you've got to manage it. You've got to get back onto your feet, get back up stronger again. There's some hybrid threats that are almost impossible to deter. So our bounce-back ability, our ability to handle adversity and to come back stronger from it, and how we program the psychology of our societies is vital in that regard. One thing I could say, from Estonia, say the subversion threat. The Estonians, their internal security service, it's called in English Kaitsepolitsei, Kapo in Estonia. I was back, I was giving a lecture last week. I remember different case studies of subversion there. We had the Herman Sim case, you'll see that hit the MOD. We had the Metsavas case, that would hit the military. We had the Alexei Drezin case, that hit Kapo itself. He was the director of Kapo. And recently, a colleague of mine, someone I thought was, we weren't particularly close, but someone I thought was a trusted colleague, we had the Morozov case. So the Estonians are very, very good. You know, you imagine what's going on elsewhere, this kind of behavior. I think these different case studies show the spectrum of how active in almost every sector that matters to security policy, the Russians have their mole and have their ability to subvert. So vigilance, expecting the unexpected, and coming back stronger in response to this subversion. So I think the last thing I'll say is the Russians are very psychological. The former Finnish Minister of Defense, no longer with us, Ilkka Kanerva, he once said that they're very skillful at sending messages, but as we might say now, and we have a terminology, they're no great shakes either. We've seen that in Ukraine. They make a lot of mistakes. So when you kind of break their psychology down, you short circuit, so to say, their hybrid interference. For instance, one thing in Finland, people, because of the winter war, and the Molotov cocktails and the Finnish pluck, the Finnish never say die, and the Finnish dedication to defending their country, or Russians in border areas, they often speak with dread and fear, historically, of the Finski noza, the Finnish knife, which was the pukko. They call it pukko in Finland. It's this all-purpose Finnish knife. Because of the Finns were so good with this improvised tactic, creeping up on Russian soldiers in the forest and taking them out with pukko. And the Russians still talk about that with dread. These guys are not to be messed with. Let them alone. The last thing I'll say, a couple of months ago, Russians, these empty threats we see from Medvedev talking up the Iskander nuclear threat from Kaliningrad, said, we might bring our Iskanders closer to the Finnish border. And the Finnish response was, okay, that's very good, because that brings them closer into range of our JASMs and we can take them out quicker. So shrug the shoulders and arrivederci, as they might say in Italy. Good night, Irene. So not sometimes with these empty threats that lead to the West self-deterring, not taking the bait, not giving the Russians the oxygen or the intention that they want with these empty threats, not rising to it. It's important.
Thank you, Thomas. Maybe you will have something.
Well, as one Finn who was asked what are the top 3 national security threats to Finland are, he said it's Russia, number 2 is Russia, and number 3 is Russia. So that's both external and internal. We have a lot of Russia in our systems. Political, economic, cultural spaces, and cognitive influences and so on, overt and covert and so on, that we absolutely must purge. I'm still hearing from my colleagues, who attended a course in France on disinformation funded by European Commission, and other course member, she's a Ukrainian, and she was ridiculed for suggesting that Sputnik was not a legitimate media outlet, but was a Russian government propaganda arm. There are still people around in the EU believing that it's a legitimate media outlet. That sort of a rubbish has to go away. I think, with regard to what is going on, we have to remember, we are now so self-absorbed sometimes in these discussions. We have to remember, our defense is taking place now in Ukraine. We are Ukraine's home front. We have to keep Ukraine's our home front, or Ukraine's home front, together, so that we do not fall apart because of political polarization, because of Russia's active measures, because of Russia's reflexive control techniques, and so on, and also help Ukraine to win this war. This is the baseline. This is the only ball in the game. This is what we cannot drop it, because if we do, the consequences will be severe. So Ukraine first, and let's get them into NATO as soon as we can. Thank you. Okay,
thank you. I will let myself to sum up our short discussion with quoting Eoin. let's not, these guys are not to be messed with. So I think one of the purpose of the total defense and also integration of two new members is to send a clear message. Yeah, we are ready for the questions from the audience. Okay, so general question for all of you maybe. How to develop Baltic Sea into internal NATO Sea? What has to be done by all NATO states along with Baltic Sea coast?
Well, a military defense that is strong and very capable, of course. I should mention also we can't afford a brigade as Germany sends to Lithuania. We will send in a couple of months, I think, 600 Swedish soldiers to Latvia. And we haven't been with Swedish soldiers in Latvia since the 17th century, so that's quite a change. But the political cooperation is extremely important. The military cooperation is extremely important. You mentioned the already existing cooperation between Sweden, Norway, and Finland. I mean, we have 200 fighters up far in the north together, and very potent fighters. It's Gripen, it will be F-35 soon, etc. So we have military capabilities. We will utilize them, but we must also have the constant political dialogue so that we can protect our values within the framework of the international system. We need to have strong diplomacy. We need to combine our diplomatic efforts in the global society. Should not accept Russia's work with the global south, for example. We should counter it. So this is extremely important. Sweden has never been in war with Persia. Today, we suspect the Iranians to operate aggressive operations from the Swedish territory. This is not acceptable. For example, just one example. So, and then we also, of course, we should share technology, we should share information about what's happening in our respective countries. And I think the Baltics is a perfect area for sharing those knowledges because people are quite cohesive here.
So sharing information is one of the points. Maybe you could...
Yeah, I mean, forgot to mention, you mentioned the F-35, of course. Finland, I mean, late 2021, one of the biggest $9.4 billion procurement to purchase the F-35. Typical Finland, you know, evidence-based policymaking. They had a program run by their Ministry of Defense called the HX Fighter Program. So when they're going to shell out that amount of money, they took 6 years to put all fighter aircraft that tendered for it through their paces, and they came up with the F-35. So it's a very formidable procurement, 64 F-35s at $9.4 billion, a 4.5 generation fighter, as they call it. So again, bringing more heavy metal to the party that is NATO, if I can use that expression I used earlier. And I'll just briefly answer the question maybe by doing some advertising. I wrote an article recently in the NATO Review, NATO's policy magazine, published out of Brussels, about NATO's role in enhanced security for critical undersea infrastructure. And the article centered on hybrid threats and the recently stood up NATO Undersea Infrastructure Coordination Cell. So, you know, we need more patrols in the Baltic Sea, more naval patrols, to ensure this undersea infrastructure is being monitored. Because there's been a boom as we dismantle Russia's energy weapon around the Baltic Sea. You know, there's going to be electricity disconnection from the Russian and Belarusian grids of the Baltic states, I think, by 2025. We already have the LNG terminal at Klaipėda since 2014. We have undersea electricity connectors connecting Latvia and Sweden. We had the Baltic Connector pipeline, gas line pipeline, which was damaged we don't exactly know the motive behind that damages yet, but we can have suspicions. That was damaged last year. So there's been a boom in undersea infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. That has been the answer to dismantling Russia's energy weapon, Russia's connection to the Baltic states, and enhancing, energy sovereignty, data sovereignty, all the rest of it. But this infrastructure is still vulnerable. We've seen that with Nord Stream. We've seen that with the Baltic Connector, and we've seen that connecting Schwabald with Norway, that it's quite easy and cheap to sabotage this infrastructure. And that's the signal from many intelligence services in Northern Europe now. Expect more sabotage. There's been a boom in sabotage. So when we talk about the maritime domain, more patrols. And the last thing I'll say about that, it's not just old-fashioned patrols, which will need more infrastructure for it. Sweden is quite well positioned in this regard to be kind of a framework nation for maritime security. But we also need to leverage new technologies, drones, submersibles, sensors, undersea unmanned vehicles, all the rest of it. We need, our innovation still gives us an edge on our competitors, in this case Russia, but also China as well. And that's a big role of the NATO undersea cell, is to bring the public sector and the private sector together, governments and businesses and investors together, so that we can really drive this technology, because that technology is going to be very, very important to maintain security of this lifeline infrastructure going forward.
Thank you.
Nature lake as a metaphor is very nice, but it's not very accurate. It implies that some sort of a total command of the sea space, the maritime space here, but we will never achieve that. And we should talking about more realistically about sea control and ability to deny Russians the possibility to threaten our sea lines of communication, our infrastructure, and so on. And if you listen to naval people, it all starts with maritime domain awareness. If we don't know what's happening above the sea, on the surface and under the surface of the sea, we cannot act. We can have as many patrol boats as we want, but if they are blind, if they are not able to see and then share that information with the littoral countries and between different platforms and so on, then there's no much sense talking about that. Second is that we have to have capabilities configured for this domain, for the Baltic Sea. NATO has, on aggregate level, pretty impressive naval capabilities. But many of those assets will never be put into the Baltic Sea. It's too small. Those expensive platforms, multi-billion platforms, will be too vulnerable. Nobody will want to put them here. They will be acting in GeoGap, in the North Atlantic, and so on, but not in the Baltic Sea. What we need here is the platforms, the old generation, corvettes, stealth corvettes. We need more submarines. So Swedes and then Germans excel at this technology suited for the Baltic Sea. The new generation, drones. Learning a lot from Ukrainian experience, borrowing a lot of design solutions and whatnot in order to be able to really dominate in this maritime space, and also have proper command arrangements. Again, MARCOM has been a lot of criticized NATO Maritime Component Command for not being properly organized for conducting operations in the Baltic Sea. This is where some nation will have to take a lead. Germans proposed the Baltic Maritime Component Command in Rostock. I think Sweden has to take a bit more a serious leadership role, because it's the longest shoreline among all the littoral countries, and really serious expertise in sensors, in maritime technologies, and so on. So again, we need to iron out this kink in the combined arrangements, so that space is for the Baltic states does not represent a problem, because we are facing this landmass to the east and our backs to the sea. We're not maritime nations. We need somebody to watch our back.
So communication, more patrols, some specific competences were mentioned as important aspects. And the very least question which I would like to address for Mr. Olof from the audience is, won't Sweden previously neutrality of 200 years prevented from preparing for real fight against Russia? You can read it yourself. So.
No, not at all. motivation is not a problem, I can tell you. I was doing my conscript service in the 70s and 80s. I can tell you there was no problem of motivation. There was none who was not very clear on who was the potential aggressor. So this is a part of the Swedes' DNA. What is the problem, I would say, is the mental preparations for having a Bucha or a bombing from Kaliningrad. Are we prepared to understand the concept of double tap when the first responders are killed by the second bomb, by the second missile? All those war crimes that Russia and Russian army and Russian soldiers, Russian officers are fully prepared to do. My uncle was killed in the Finnish war with explosive ammunition. Already then. Today the war crimes are even worse. Are we prepared? Do we have enough stamina after more than 200 years in a peaceful environment? We have seen all those, we have seen the Ukraine and Gaza, we have seen all those ruins, but are we prepared to take those hits for a long time? I think that's one reason why the mental preparation is so important. And I also will echo what you said about the underwater sea lanes. Sweden has never been in war with China. China made an operation where they put down their anchor and cut the cables between.
They said it's all an accident.
Yeah, say it's all an accident.
Terrible accident.
A terrible accident. But we have China. I think we saw the map yesterday about the Chinese maneuvering in the Baltic Sea together with the Russians. So we have an uphill battle in that sense. But I am absolutely, totally sure that the Swedish people are prepared to take on Russia in that sense. We have 95% popular support for the government's report to Ukraine, and we have 100% in the parliament. So I would say the opinion in Sweden, public opinion in Sweden, is the strongest in the world behind Ukraine. And that's serious. It's not just showing off. It's serious.
Thank you so much. Since we are already run out of time, I'll just thank you for a discussion and really interesting insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.